One quiet afternoon, a fleeting moment shattered the careful distance we had maintained, changing everything in its wake. It began like any other Saturday our parents had gone out for. The day, caught up in their usual weekend plans. I didn't think much of it. Having the house to myself was always a welcome break. But this Saturday was different. This time, I wasn't alone. My stepsister Madison had stayed back, and there was an unspoken tension in the air, making everything feel charged in a way I couldn't ignore. I wandered down the stairs expecting to hear the usual buzz of the TV or the soft sound of music drifting from her room, but the house was still too quiet. I didn't know where Madison was, but the silence somehow made me feel like she was waiting for something for me. Maybe the thought made me pause halfway down the staircase. Ridiculous. I told myself, shaking off the idea as quickly as it had come, as I stepped into the kitchen. I caught a glimpse of her sitting at the dining table, absent-minded, stirring a cup of coffee. She was looking out the window, but there was a certain stillness about her, like her mind was miles away. Her long, dark hair fell over her shoulder, and she had that look she got when she was deep in thought, totally unaware of her surroundings. "Morning," I said, breaking the silence. She jumped a little startled out of her thoughts. "Oh, hey, Nick. I didn't hear you come down. Didn't mean to sneak up on you," I replied, grabbing a mug from the cabinet. "What's on your mind?" Madison shrugged, offering a small smile. But there was something off in her expression. Just nothing, really. Just one of those mornings. I guess she looked away, focusing on her coffee again. And I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more behind her words. There'd always been a kind of distance between us. Even though our parents had been married for over a year, now we were still getting used to each other. Not exactly strangers, but not family either. Somewhere in between. "You have any plans today?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Not really. Just thought I'd stay in and maybe watch something. "Later," she said, glancing up at me. "You pretty much the same," I replied, pouring coffee into my mug. "I thought I'd just take it easy." She nodded, and for a moment neither of us said anything. The silence was thick, stretching on for just a little too long. I felt a strange tension in the air, like there was something we weren't saying. I'd been aware of it for weeks now. This subtle shift in how we interacted, small things, like the way her gaze would linger a second too long, or how she'd sit a little closer than necessary. It was unsettling but intriguing, too. "Do you want to watch something together?" she asked, suddenly breaking the silence. "I mean, since we're both here and all sure," I said, trying to sound nonchalant, even though my heart had picked up its pace a little. "Why not?" Madison got up and headed toward the living room, and I followed her, settling onto the couch. She picked a random movie, something neither of us really cared about. We sat there pretending to watch, but I was acutely aware of her beside me every time she shifted. I felt it like her presence was amplified. Somehow, halfway through the movie, she laughed at a scene that wasn't even funny, and I turned to look at her. "What's so funny?" She looked over at me, her eyes sparkling with something I couldn't quite place. "I don't know. I guess I'm just in a weird mood today." I raised an eyebrow. Weird how she hesitated, biting her lip in a way that made my pulse skip. I don't know. Being around you, it's different, like, not in a bad way, just different. There was something in the way she said it that made my heart race. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to address the unspoken thing hanging between us. We were step-siblings, after all. That's all we were supposed to be. But lately, it felt like there was something more beneath the surface, something neither of us dared to acknowledge. Before I could figure out how to respond, she shifted closer, her knee brushing against mine. I felt a jolt go through me, and I was suddenly very aware of how close we were sitting. You ever feel like we were supposed to meet even before our parents got together? she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I swallowed, trying to keep my tone steady. I don't know. I never really thought about it like that. Her eyes held mine, and there was something there, something intense that I couldn't look away from. Maybe you should. The room felt too small, too quiet, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to ignore the way her gaze lingered, the way her fingers, absent, played with the edge of the couch cushion, but it was impossible. The tension between us was practically tangible. I cleared my throat, trying to break the moment. Maybe I should make some popcorn. Madison laughed softly, but there was a hint of disappointment in her eyes. Sure, I'll pause the movie. I got up, grateful for the excuse to put some distance between us. As I stood in the kitchen waiting for the popcorn to pop, I tried to make sense of what was happening. This was Madison, my stepsister. We weren't supposed to feel anything, right? And yet I couldn't deny the magnetic pull between us. When I returned with the popcorn, she smiled up at me, her eyes warm and inviting. I handed her the bowl, and as she took it, her fingers brushed against mine. It was such a small touch, but it sent a shiver down my spine. We resumed the movie, but I couldn't focus my thoughts, kept drifting back to that look in her eyes, that spark of something unspoken. I could feel her watching me, studying me out of the corner of her eye. It made my pulse quicken, and I wondered if she felt the same tension I did. You know, it's kind of nice hanging out like this, she said quietly, her voice breaking the silence. Yeah, I replied, my voice a little rougher than I intended. It is. She turned to face me, her expression soft. We should do this more often. Just spend time together. You know? There was a vulnerability in her eyes that caught me off guard, a glimpse of something deeper. I felt a pang of guilt for even thinking about her in a way I shouldn't, but at the same time I couldn't help it. She was right here, inches away, and I couldn't ignore the feelings stirring inside me. The rest of the day passed in a haze of small talk and stolen glances, each one filled with that strange, undeniable tension. By the time the movie ended, I felt exhausted, like I'd been holding my breath the entire time. As she stood up to stretch, she looked at me over her shoulder, a soft smile playing on her lips. Thanks for hanging out with me. Nick, I know it's not typical. Yeah, well, I replied, forcing a smile. Maybe typical isn't all it's cracked up to be. She laughed, a genuine warm sound that made my heart race. Good point. For a moment, she lingered as if there was something more she wanted to say, but then she shook her head almost as if she was dismissing a thought and gave me one last smile before heading upstairs. I watched her go, feeling a strange mix of relief and disappointment. Part of me was glad the day was over, but another part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between us, something I couldn't ignore. No matter how hard I tried, as I sat there alone, I couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. The line between us felt blurred, and I had a feeling that it wasn't going to be as easy as I thought to go back to normal. But deep down, I knew there was more to come. The next day, the house was unusually quiet. I tried to distract myself to forget the subtle tension that had wrapped itself around every interaction with Madison, but it was impossible. Every time I thought of her, a strange mix of guilt and anticipation rose in me, refusing to let me be. I spent most of the morning pacing around the living room, checking my phone, staring out the window. I knew it was ridiculous. I didn't need to wait around for her, but it felt like something unsaid was still hanging between us, waiting for one of us to bring it to life. I finally heard her footsteps coming down the stairs, and my heart skipped a beat. She was humming softly to herself, completely oblivious to the tension gnawing at me. When she saw me, she stopped humming and offered a small smile, almost as if she knew I'd been waiting. "Hey," she said, casually adjusting the sleeves of her sweater. "Hey," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Sleep? Well, she shrugged. Yeah. I guess she hesitated for a moment, looking at me thoughtfully as if she were deciding whether or not to say something. Actually, I couldn't stop thinking about yesterday. My heart thudded in my chest. She hadn't forgotten either. Oh, she shifted her weight, looking down at her hands. I don't know. It was nice, spending time together, just us. Her words echoed what I'd been feeling, and for a moment I felt a strange relief. I wasn't alone in this. Whatever this was, it was something we were both feeling, something we were both trying and failing to ignore. We fell into silence, but it wasn't a comfortable one. There was a weight between us, a tension that seemed to build with every second. I tried to break it, to say something that would make things feel normal again, but before I could speak, Madison stepped closer, her eyes meeting mine. Do you ever wonder what it would be like if things were different? She asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. My throat went dry. I knew what she was asking, even though she hadn't said it directly, and I knew I should step back, that I should laugh it off, make a joke, anything to keep us from crossing a line. But instead, I found myself nodding. Yeah. I admitted, my voice shaky. I think about it. She looked down, a faint smile playing on her lips. I thought I was the only one. The tension in the room was suffocating now, so thick it felt like I could reach out and touch it. Part of me wanted to run, to put as much distance as possible between us. But another part, a stronger part, kept me rooted in place, drawn to her in a way I couldn't explain. Nick. She said my name softly, and something in her tone made my heart race. She took another step closer, so close now that I could feel the warmth radiating from her, could see the slight flush on her cheeks. We don't have to make this complicated. No one would ever have to know the words. Hit me like a punch to the gut. What do you mean? She looked away, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. I mean, we don't have to pretend, We don't have to act like we're just step-siblings, if that's not how we feel. The reality of what she was suggesting hit me hard, and I struggled to find my footing. This was Madison, my stepsister. We were supposed to be family, but there was no denying the pull between us, the unspoken understanding that had been growing stronger. Every day I took a shaky breath, my mind racing. Maddie. This is crazy. What would people think? She laughed softly, but there was a sadness in her eyes. Why should it matter? We're not hurting anyone. It's just us. The room felt like it was shrinking, the walls closing in as I struggled to make sense of my own thoughts. I knew this was wrong, that we were playing with fire, but the way she looked at me made it impossible to think clearly. I shook my head, trying to regain some control. I don't know if I can do this. Maddie, it's not right. Her expression softened, and she reached out her hand, resting lightly on my arm. The touch was gentle, almost hesitant, but it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. Nick, we're not doing anything wrong. We're just being honest. The sincerity in her voice, the openness in her eyes made it hard to argue. She wasn't pushing me, wasn't asking for anything more than the truth. And the truth was, I didn't want to let go of this, whatever it was, even if it was wrong, even if it was dangerous. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on me. Okay, I said, finally, my voice barely above a whisper. But we have to be careful. No one can know. A slow smile spread across her face and she nodded. I know this will just be our secret. The relief in her eyes was mirrored by my own, and for a moment it felt like a weight had been lifted. We didn't have to pretend anymore. We didn't have to fight the feelings that had been simmering between us. We could just be. We spent the rest of the day together talking, laughing, sharing small moments that felt more intimate than they should have. Every time our eyes met, there was an unspoken connection, a sense of understanding that went beyond words. It was like we were sharing a secret, something precious and fragile that only we understood. But as the day wore on, the reality of what we were doing started to sink in the closer we got, and the harder it became to ignore the risks, the consequences that loomed just beneath the surface. That night, as we sat in the dim light of the living room, I felt a strange sense of anticipation, a feeling that something was about to happen, something that would change everything. Madison was sitting beside me, her head resting on my shoulder, and I could feel her breath soft and steady against my skin. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. "Nick, are you sure about this?" Her question caught me off guard, and I struggled to find the right words. I didn't know if I was sure. I didn't know if this was something I could handle, something I could keep hidden. But the thought of walking away, of pretending like none of this mattered, felt impossible. "Yeah," I said finally, my voice rough. I'm sure she smiled, and the tension between us seemed to ease, if only for a moment. But even as we sat there wrapped in the comfort of each other's presence, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on the edge of something dangerous, something we couldn't control in that moment. I realized that this wasn't just a game, wasn't just a passing phase. This was something real, something that could destroy us if we weren't careful. And as much as I wanted to believe that we could keep it a secret, that we could keep it safe, I knew deep down that secrets like this didn't stay hidden for long. But for now, we were together, and that was all that mattered. A few days later, Madison and I found ourselves alone in the house again. It was starting to feel normal, these quiet moments when it was just the two of us. Like we had this secret world no one else could touch. But today it felt different. The tension that had always simmered between us had grown into something more, something neither of us could ignore anymore. We were sitting in the living room, the soft glow of the late afternoon sun casting a warm light over everything. Madison was curled up on the couch beside me, close enough that I could feel the heat of her body, her shoulder brushing against mine every time she moved. So she said, breaking the silence, "Are you ever going to tell me what you're thinking?" I laughed, nervously looking away. "I don't know if you really want to know." She tilted her head, her gaze piercing. "Try me." The challenge in her voice was enough to make my heart skip a beat. I turned to face her, feeling a strange sense of vulnerability. "Okay. I guess I've been thinking about us, about what we're doing." Madison smiled softly, her eyes searching mine. "And do you regret it?" I hesitated, but the answer was clear. Number. I don't. Her smile widened and she shifted closer, her hand resting lightly on my arm. Me neither. For a moment we just sat there, our eyes locked, and it felt like the rest of the world had faded away. There was nothing but the two of us caught in this moment that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. Slowly, almost hesitantly, she reached up her fingers, brushing against my cheek. Her touch was soft, barely there, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I closed my eyes, leaning into her hand, letting myself get lost in the warmth of her skin. When I opened my eyes, she was watching me with an intensity that took my breath away. "Nick," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Can I?" I didn't need her to finish the question. The answer was already written in the way I was looking at her, in the way my heart was pounding in my chest. I leaned forward, closing the distance between us, and in that moment, everything else disappeared. Our lips met in a soft, tentative kiss, a gentle brush that was both new and familiar at the same time. Her lips were warm, soft, and the taste of her sent a thrill through me that I couldn't ignore. I pulled back slightly, looking into her eyes, searching for any sign of hesitation. but all I saw was the same longing that was burning in me. She leaned in again, her arms wrapping around my neck, and our lips met once more, this time deeper, more certain. The kiss grew more intense, and I could feel the warmth spreading through my body, my hands finding their way to her waist, pulling her closer until there was no space left between us. Her fingers tangled in my hair, and I felt myself losing control, giving in to the feelings I'd tried so hard to push away. Everything about this felt wrong, but in the best possible way. It was like we were breaking every rule. But in that moment, none of it mattered. All that mattered was her, the way she felt in my arms, the way her breath hitched when I kissed her. "Nick," she whispered against my lips, her voice shaky. "Are you sure about this?" I pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, my hand brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "I've never been more sure of anything." She smiled, a soft, vulnerable smile that made my heart ache. And then she was kissing me again, deeper. This time as if she was afraid this moment would slip away if she didn't hold on tight enough. I felt her fingers trail down my neck, sending shivers through me, and I pulled her closer, needing to feel every inch of her, to know that this was real. We stayed like that, tangled together on the couch, lost in each other. Her hands explored my back, her fingers tracing small circles that made my skin tingle, and I could feel her heart beat a fast and unsteady, matching my own every touch. Every kiss felt like a promise, like we were creating something that belonged only to us. At some point we shifted, and I found myself lying back on the couch with her above me, her hair falling around us like a curtain blocking out the rest of the world. She looked down at me, her eyes dark and filled with something I couldn't quite name, but it made my pulse race. I reached up, pulling her down to me, and our lips met again, softer, this time more tender. "Nick," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "I don't want this to end." I brushed my thumb across her cheek, my heart pounding. "Then let's not think about it ending." She nodded, her eyes shining with something close to tears, and I felt a surge of protective, a need to hold her to make sure nothing ever hurt her. In that moment, I realized just how deep my feelings for her ran, how much she'd come to mean to me. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, our bodies intertwined, lost in the serenity of each other's embrace. Soft kisses and whispered words were the only language we needed. Our connection transcended words, defying explanation. Every moment deepened our bond, forging an unspoken understanding. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the room bathed in warm, golden light. Shadows danced across the walls. Madison's head rested on my chest, her gentle breath a soothing melody. Her fingers traced lazy patterns on my arm, sending shivers of contentment through me. In that tranquil moment, everything felt right with the world. Our hearts beat in harmony, our love, a sanctuary from life's chaos. Time stood still. "Nick," she murmured, her voice soft. "What are we going to do?" I looked down at her, brushing my fingers through her hair. "I don't know," I admitted. "But right now, I don't want to think about anything but you." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with trust, and for the first time I felt like maybe we could make this work. Like maybe this secret we shared could be something beautiful, something that didn't have to be hidden. But as much as I wanted to believe that, a part of me knew that things couldn't stay this way forever. Eventually, we'd have to face the reality of what we were doing, of the line we'd crossed. But right now, with her in my arms, none of that mattered. All that mattered was her, and the way she made me feel like I was finally where I was meant to be. I held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, and for the first time in a long time I felt content. This was where I belonged, with her in this moment that felt like it would never end. We spent the rest of the night together, sharing secrets and dreams, talking about everything and nothing, our words blending together in the quiet of the house. It was like we'd created our own little world, a place where nothing could touch us, where we could be exactly who we were without fear or judgment. And as the first light of dawn crept through the windows, I realized that no matter what happened, no matter where life took us, I would never forget this night. This moment would stay with me, a memory that would always belong to just the two of us. But deep down, I knew that the world outside our little bubble would come crashing in. Eventually, we couldn't hide forever. And when that moment came, I didn't know if we'd be strong enough to face it. For now, though, I held her close, savoring the warmth of her skin, the softness of her breath against my neck. And I let myself believe just for a little while that this was enough, because right now it was. As the days passed, the memories of that night lingered between Madison and me, weaving their way into every glance, every shared moment. But the weight of what we'd done, of what we were becoming, grew heavier too. Being together had felt effortless in the quiet of the night, but in the light of day, reality began to creep in. We couldn't hide forever. Madison and I kept up the pretense around our parents, careful not to leave any signs that might hint at what was really happening. But the tension was there, a constant undercurrent that was impossible to ignore. Every time I saw her, every time we were alone, it was like we were playing a dangerous game, one where a single wrong move could expose everything. One afternoon, I found her sitting by herself in the backyard, her knees drawn up to her chest, staring out into the distance. I could tell from the way her shoulders were tense that something was bothering her. I approached quietly, sitting down beside her, and she glanced at me, offering a small, strained smile. "Hey," I said softly, reaching out to touch her hand. She looked down at our hands, her fingers brushing against mine. "Hey." We sat in silence for a while, and I could feel the worry radiating off her. "What's going on? Maddie?" She sighed, her gaze never leaving the horizon. "I don't know. Nick, sometimes it just feels like this is all too much, you know?" I nodded, my heart sinking. "I know what you mean." She turned to look at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and longing. "Do you ever wonder how long we can keep this up? How long we can pretend like everything's normal?" I swallowed, feeling the weight of her question. It was something I'd been asking myself every day. "Yeah," I admitted. "I think about it all the time." Her face softened and she leaned her head against my shoulder. "I don't want to lose you, Nick, but sometimes I wonder if we're just setting ourselves up for heartbreak." I wrapped my arm around her, pulling her closer. "We'll figure it out, Maddie. I don't know how, but we'll find a way." She closed her eyes, resting against me, and for a moment it felt like we were back in our own little world. But as the shadows grew longer, I could feel the reality of our situation pressing down on us, the uncertainty gnawing at the edges of our fragile happiness. A few days later, everything changed. Our parents had invited some family friends over for dinner, and Madison and I had spent the day helping prepare. I'd kept my distance, trying to avoid any chance of slipping up, but it was hard every time our eyes met. I felt that familiar pull, the one I couldn't resist, the one that reminded me of everything we'd shared. As the guests arrived, I could tell Madison was struggling too. She was quieter than usual. Her smile forced her laughter a little too loud. I wanted to reach out to reassure her, but I knew we had to keep our distance. Dinner was a blur of forced smiles and polite conversation, but every now and then I'd catch Madison's gaze across the table, and the world seemed to narrow down to just the two of us. It was a dangerous dance, one that left me feeling both exhilarated and terrified. After dinner, I went outside to get some air, needing a moment to clear my head. The night was cool, the stars scattered across the sky like distant fireflies, and for a moment I let myself forget about everything. Our parents, the guests, the impossible situation we were in. I closed my eyes, breathing in the crisp night air, trying to find some sense of calm. But then I heard footsteps behind me, and I knew it was her. Before I even turned around, Madison stood there, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the porch light. There was something in her eyes, a quiet determination that took my breath away. She stepped closer, and before I knew it, her arms were around me, holding me tight. I could feel her heartbeat against mine, fast and unsteady, and I held her close, not caring who might see. I needed this. She whispered, her voice barely audible. I needed you. My heart ached at her words, and I buried my face in her hair, breathing her in me too. We stood there for a long time, wrapped up in each other, the world around us fading into the background. It felt like a stolen moment, a brief reprieve from the chaos of everything that had come before. But deep down, I knew it couldn't last. Eventually, we pulled away, and I could see the sadness in her eyes, the unspoken understanding that we were running out of time. She took my hand, squeezing it tightly, and I knew she felt it too, the inevitability of what lay ahead. The days that followed were filled with an unbearable tension, a sense that we were on the edge of something we couldn't control every time we were alone. The connection between us felt stronger, more intense, but the fear of being found out was always there, lurking in the background. Then one evening I found Madison sitting in the living room, a distant look in her eyes. She looked up as I walked in, and there was a sadness in her expression that sent a pang through me. We can't keep doing this, can we? She asked softly, her voice filled with resignation. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to tell her that we could make this work if we just tried hard enough. But another part of me knew she was right. This wasn't sustainable. We were living in a bubble, a fantasy that couldn't last. I don't want to stop. I admitted, my voice rough, but I don't want to hurt you either. She nodded, looking away. I know, and I don't want to hurt you. But maybe we're just not meant to be together. Not like this. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. I wanted to argue, to fight for us, but deep down I knew she was right. We'd shared something beautiful, something I'd never forget. But the reality of our situation was too much. We couldn't keep living in this shadow, pretending like everything was okay. We sat in silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts, the weight of our decisions tilling over us like a thick fog. It was a quiet goodbye, one that didn't need words. We both knew what we were giving up, what we were letting go of. In the days that followed, Madison and I drifted back into our roles as step-siblings, the distance between us growing with each passing day. It was painful, a constant reminder of what we'd lost, but it was also a relief, a way to let go of the weight that had been pressing down on us. But sometimes late at night, I'd find myself thinking of her, of the moments we'd shared, the secrets we'd kept, and a bittersweet ache would settle in my chest. I knew I'd never forget her, never forget the way she'd looked at me that night under the stars, the way her hand had felt in mine. Our lives moved on, and we found our way back to normal, or as close to normal as we could get. We became friends again, step-siblings in the truest sense, and though the memories lingered, they faded with time, becoming just that, memories. In the end, we found peace in letting go, in accepting that some things aren't meant to last no matter how deeply they're felt. And while I knew I'd carry those memories with me forever, I also knew that we'd both be okay. We'd loved and let go, and in a way that was its own kind of happy ending.